The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, 7 days after we moved in, while I was standing in the kitchen of our new house trying to decide where the coffee mug should go. This is the kind of detail that shouldn't matter in the telling of a story like this, and yet I find I cannot tell it without including it, because there is something about the specific ordinariness of what I was doing, standing at an open cabinet, holding two mugs, genuinely uncertain whether the shelf at eye level or the one above it better served the particular logic of a kitchen I was still learning. That made what happened next feel so startlingly out of register with the life I believed I was in the middle of constructing. I had been happy, that afternoon. Quietly, specifically, entirely happy, the kind of happiness that comes from the early days of a new house, when every room is still a question you're in the pleasant process of answering, when the smell of fresh paint and old wood and someone else's decades of living are still present in the air. When the particular quality of afternoon light coming through unfamiliar windows reminds you that you have chosen something new and the choosing still feels like possibility rather than commitment. I had been genuinely, unreservedly happy. And then my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. It was a local area code, which in our new town meant something different than it would have meant in the city we'd moved from. In the city, an unknown local number was almost certainly a delivery service or a doctor's office or something equally mundane. In a town of 11,000 people, an unknown local number was considerably more likely to be a person. I answered, still holding one of the coffee mugs. "Is this Claire?" The voice was elderly, precise, carrying the particular quality of someone who had grown up in an era when telephone calls were not casual things and therefore still approached each one with a certain formality. "Yes," I said. "This is Agnes Whitmore," she said. "I sold you my house." I want to tell you about Agnes Whitmore, because understanding who she was when we bought the house is essential for understanding why the call she was making 7 days after the sale mattered as much as it did. My name is Claire. I had been married to my husband, Robert, for 4 years when we bought Agnes's house, and the purchase itself had been the culmination of what felt, at the time, like a long and effortful journey towards something we had both wanted for longer than the marriage itself. We had saved carefully, looked at more properties than I can accurately count, disagreed in the specific, revealing way that house hunting surfaces disagreements between people who are generally aligned, about location and space and character and compromise, and had eventually arrived at Agnes's house on a Tuesday morning in late September with our real estate agent and the particular wary optimism of a couple who has been disappointed before and is trying not to want something too much before they know if they can have it. We had wanted it immediately. Both of us, independently and visibly, in the first 3 minutes of walking through the front door. The house was a Victorian, built in 1894, with the specific, accumulated character of a building that has been genuinely inhabited rather than merely occupied, wide plank floors worn smooth in paths that traced the movements of everyone who had lived there, window seats deep enough to curl into, a kitchen that had been updated practically rather than fashionably, a garden that had been tended with evident love for what appeared to be several decades. Agnes Whitmore had lived in the house for 51 years. We had met her at the second viewing, which she had requested to attend herself rather than simply leaving the property in the hands of her own agent. She was 83, small and very upright, with white hair and the kind of precise, attentive eyes that make you want to say accurate things rather than comfortable ones. She had shown us through rooms she had known for 51 years with a careful specificity. This window sticks slightly in winter, this floorboard sings if you step on the left edge, the roses along the south wall need cutting back in February or they become ambitious. She had been, throughout that second viewing, assessing us. Not unkindly, but without pretense about what she was doing. She was deciding whether we were the right people for her house, which is not the same calculation most sellers are making, and I think we both understood this and conducted ourselves accordingly. At the end of the viewing, she had looked at Robert for a long moment and then at me, and she had said, with the directness of someone who no longer has patience for indirection, "You'll take care of it." It was not a question. "We will," I said. She had nodded, once, and that had been, essentially, the entirety of our negotiation. The box had appeared on the morning of our move-in, which was to say it had not appeared at all in the sense of arriving from somewhere, but had been discovered in the way that things are discovered in old houses, by being suddenly visible in a space where you had not previously thought to look. Robert had found it. He had been carrying boxes into the back bedroom, the one we had decided to use as a study, and he had noticed, in the closet of that room, which we had opened twice during viewings without paying particular attention to its interior, a cardboard box on the upper shelf, pushed toward the back, not hidden exactly but not easily seen unless you were specifically looking at that shelf from the correct angle. He had brought it out and set it on the floor of the hallway and looked at it with the mild curiosity of someone who has encountered an ordinary object rather than a significant one. It was a box of medium size, sealed with tape that had aged to yellow at the edges, unlabeled, with no distinguishing features beyond the particular density of something that had been packed with care rather than convenience, the corners precise, the tape applied in straight lines, the kind of packing that suggests someone thought carefully about what they were enclosing rather than simply closing a container. Agnes must have left it, I said, which was the obvious conclusion. I'll call the agent, Robert said. See if she wants us to drop it somewhere. He had not asked what was in it. Had not suggested we open it. Had simply identified it as something belonging to someone else and moved immediately to the practical question of how to return it. This was characteristic of Robert in ways that I had always found admirable, a fundamental respect for the boundaries of what belonged to him and what did not. He called the agent. The agent said she would pass the message along. Robert set the box in the corner of the hallway, near the front door, where it would be easily accessible when Agnes's response came, and we continued with the work of moving in. The box sat in the corner of the hallway for 7 days. It was, I want to be clear, not a mysterious presence during those 7 days. I did not think about it with particular frequency or assign its significance beyond the ordinary significance of a forgotten object belonging to a previous occupant. I walked past it many times a day during that first week, registering it each time the way you register familiar furniture, present, noted, requiring no further attention. And then Agnes called. You found the box, she said, after I confirmed who I was. It was not quite a question, but it had the quality of something she had been preparing to learn rather than assuming. We did, I said. Robert called the agent about it. We weren't sure how to get it back to you. A pause. Not the pause of someone thinking of what to say, but the pause of someone who has already decided what to say and is simply ensuring they are ready to say it. Claire, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think about it before you answer. I set down the coffee mug I was still holding. Something in her voice had shifted, not dramatically, but distinctly, the specific register of a conversation changing its nature from ordinary to something else. Of course, I said. The box on the upper shelf of the back bedroom closet, she said. The sealed one. I need you to not let your husband open it. I stood in the kitchen of my new house, in the afternoon light coming through the unfamiliar windows, and I processed this sentence. I'm sorry. I said. Not because I hadn't heard her. Because I needed the moment of saying it. I know how that sounds, Agnes said, and there was something in her voice that was neither apology nor embarrassment but something older and more settled, the sound of a woman who has made a decision after a very long time of not making it. I know it is an unusual thing to ask. But I am asking it, and I am asking it seriously, and I hope you will extend me the courtesy of taking it seriously before you decide what to do. Agnes, I said, carefully, can you tell me why? Another pause. Longer. Not on the telephone, she said. I would like you to come and see me. I'm staying with my daughter, on Whitmore Lane, yes, the same name, it's a long story. Number 14. Could you come tomorrow? In the afternoon. I looked through the kitchen doorway at the hall, at the corner near the front door where the box sat in its precise, tape-sealed stillness. Can you tell me anything? I said. Just something, to help me understand what I'm agreeing to. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, something that I have turned over in my mind many times since that Tuesday afternoon. "There are things in that box," she said, "that I should have addressed 50 years ago and did not, because I was afraid of what addressing them would cost me. I am 83 years old and I have recently understood that the cost of not addressing them has been higher than the cost of addressing them would have been, and I would like to address them now, if you will allow me to." I said nothing for a moment. "I will come tomorrow," I said. "In the afternoon." "Thank you," she said. And then, before she hung up, she added one more sentence, quietly and without drama: "Please don't mention this call to Robert." After she hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor. The coffee mug sat on the counter where I'd been deciding about the shelves, the decision abandoned, unresolved. I thought about Agnes's face at the second viewing, the way she had looked at Robert and then at me before saying "you'll take care of it." I thought about the box in the corner of the hallway, its precise corners and its yellowed tape, sitting there for 7 days without significance and suddenly full of it. I thought about whether to tell Robert about the call, about what Agnes had asked, and I found, turning this question over, that I could not identify a version of telling him that would serve any purpose Agnes had suggested was worth serving. She had asked me not to tell him, and the asking had not been arbitrary. It had been, whatever else it was, specific and intentional, coming from a woman who had chosen her words with care. I decided to go. I decided, also, that I would not tell Robert where I was going. Not yet. Perhaps not until I understood what I was agreeing to by agreeing to go. This decision, small as it seemed in the moment I made it, was the first in a sequence of decisions that would, over the following weeks, change how I understood the house we had bought, the woman who had sold it to us, and, eventually, something about my own marriage that I had not fully allowed myself to examine. But on that Tuesday afternoon, standing in my kitchen with the coffee mugs on the counter and the box in the hallway and Agnes's voice still present in the air, I simply stood for a moment longer and looked at the afternoon light moving across the floor of my new house. Then I went back to deciding about the shelves. I told Robert the first was going to visit a neighbor the following afternoon. This was not technically a lie. Agnes Whitmore had been a neighbor, in the sense that she had lived in the house we now occupied, on the street where we now lived, for 51 years. The relationship between that technical truth and the spirit of what Robert would have understood by the word neighbor was something I chose not to examine too closely, which was itself a small thing that I noted and filed without immediately knowing what to do with. Robert had nodded when I said it, barely looking up from the bookshelf he was assembling in the study, the kind of unconcerned acknowledgement that passes between two people who have built enough trust that the movements of daily life don't require detailed accounting. I had watched him nod and felt something complicated that I also filed without immediately addressing, and then I had gotten in the car and driven to Whitmore Lane. Agnes's daughter's house was 15 minutes from ours, on a quiet residential street that had the particular character of a neighborhood built in the 1960s and maintained with the specific pride of people who have lived in the same houses for decades and have strong opinions about lawn maintenance. Number 14 was a brick bungalow with a front garden that was considerably tidier than its neighbors, which I suspected was Agnes's influence rather than her daughter's. Agnes answered the door before I knocked, which I was beginning to understand was simply how she operated, attending to arrivals before they announced themselves, maintaining a quiet authority over the threshold between outside and inside that was, I thought, probably a quality that had developed across 51 years of presiding over a Victorian house with a front path long enough to see visitors coming. She looked, in the doorway of her daughter's bungalow, slightly smaller than she had during our viewings, the specific reduction that happens to people when you see them in a context that doesn't fully fit them. Agnes Whitmore was a woman built for high ceilings and wide plank floors. The bungalow, which was perfectly comfortable and perfectly adequate, had neither, and she stood in its doorway with the slightly compressed quality of someone whose natural habitat was elsewhere. "You came," she said. "I said I would," I said. She stepped aside to let me in, and I followed her through a hallway that smelled of beeswax and something floral and into a sitting room at the back of the house that had been made, through the arrangement of particular furniture and objects, into something that felt more like Agnes than the rest of the bungalow did. A specific chair by the window, old, upholstered in worn green fabric, clearly brought from elsewhere. A side table with a lamp whose base was a particular shade of blue that I recognized from the bedroom in our house. Books arranged with the specificity of someone who has read them all and knows exactly where each one lives. She had, I understood, brought the most essential pieces of herself here, into this smaller space, and arranged them in the configuration that most accurately represented her. It was a kind of portable version of the life she had lived in our house, condensed and carried with her. We sat down, she in her green chair and I on the sofa across from it, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with the attentive, assessing quality I remembered from the viewings. "You didn't tell him," she said. "No," I said. "Thank you," she said. "Then, how is the house?" The question surprised me with its ordinariness, and then didn't surprise me, because Agnes was a woman who understood that important conversations required approach rather than immediate arrival. "It's becoming ours," I said. Slowly. "It's the kind of house that requires some time before it feels like it belongs to you." 51 years, she said, and it still sometimes felt like it belonged to itself. She said this with a warmth that suggested she had considered this quality a feature rather than a flaw. "Tell me about those years," I said. "If you're willing. Before you tell me about the box." She looked at me for a moment, reading something in the request. "You want context," she said. "I think the box will mean more with it," I said. She considered this and then nodded, and what followed was 40 minutes of one of the most concentrated pieces of human history I have ever been offered, delivered in the precise, unhurried language of a woman who had been composing this account in her own mind for longer than I had been alive. Agnes had moved into the house in 1971, newly married to a man named Edmund Whitmore, who had purchased it as a wedding gift of sorts, not extravagantly. The house had been considerably less valuable then, and Edmund had been a man of modest but steady means, a solicitor in the town's only established firm, careful and reliable in the way of people who have internalized the long view on everything. She had loved him, Agnes said. She said this first, before anything else, with a simplicity and directness that made it clear she considered it the foundational fact of everything that followed, the context without which nothing else could be properly understood. She had loved Edmund Whitmore completely and specifically, for 37 years, until his death in 2008, and she continued to love the particular version of him that existed in her memory with a fidelity that had not diminished in the 15 years since. "But," I said, because there was clearly a but, and because I thought Agnes was the kind of woman who appreciated not having to build to it. She looked at me with something that might have been appreciation. "But Edmund," she said, "was a man who kept things." She did not mean this in the ordinary sense of a person who is reluctant to discard. She meant something more specific and more significant, which she took the next several minutes to unfold with the careful precision of someone who has decided, finally, to be fully accurate rather than partially kind. Edmund Whitmore had been, in all the ways that Agnes had directly experienced him, a good man. Patient, principled, devoted to her and to their children, reliable in the specific, sustained way that is less dramatic than passion but considerably more useful across the decades. She had no complaint against the man she had known. What she had discovered, 7 months after his death, while sorting through the papers in his study with the thorough efficiency of a woman who had always managed practical matters and saw no reason grief should alter this, what she had discovered was evidence of a version of Edmund Whitmore that she had not known existed. "Not another woman," she said. "I want to be clear about that," she added, with the specific emphasis of someone who has had this misunderstood before. "Not infidelity in any conventional sense. Something different. Something that was, in its own way, considerably more difficult to incorporate into the understanding she had built of her marriage. Edmund had had a child. Before Agnes. Before their marriage, before they had even met, when Edmund was 22 and working in a different city and living a version of his life that he had, by the time he met Agnes 3 years later, apparently decided to treat as a separate chapter rather than a continuous story. A child born to a woman whose name appeared in Edmund's papers only once, in a letter that was brief and formal and dated 1968, in which she informed him that she was managing and did not require anything from him, and that she thought it best they have no further contact. Edmund had kept the letter. He had kept it for 40 years, folded inside a book that Agnes had never had occasion to open, preserved with the careful, guilty attention of a man who had decided that acknowledgement in private was the only form of acknowledgement he was prepared to offer. Agnes had sat in Edmund's study in 2008, holding this letter, and she described this with a searching precision, trying to be accurate rather than dramatic, not betrayed exactly, because Edmund's transgression had predated their relationship and the woman had herself closed the door on any ongoing connection. What she had felt was something more complicated. The discovery that the man she had known across 37 years had also been a man with a chapter he had never shared, a private accounting he had maintained alongside their shared life, a piece of himself that had existed in their house. She gestured, vaguely, in the direction of where our house would be, for decades without her knowledge. She had not known what to do with this information. She had put the letter in a box. She had added to the box, over the following months, the other documents she found that related to this chapter of Edmund's life, a photograph, 2 additional letters she discovered later, some financial records that suggested Edmund had, at some point in the late 1970s, made a private arrangement she had also not known about. She had sealed the box and put it on the upper shelf of the back bedroom closet and she had not opened it again. She had told no one. Not her children. Not her friends. Not the grief counselor she had seen for 8 months after Edmund's death. She had processed his loss in the ordinary way, with ordinary grief, and she had carried this additional, private knowledge alongside that grief without allowing it to touch the grief, as though the two things could be kept separate if she was sufficiently careful. For 15 years she had kept them separate. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked when she paused. "And why me, specifically? You don't know me. We met twice, during viewings." Agnes looked at me with the kind of look that contains more than its surface. "I told myself, when I put the box on that shelf," she said, "that I was simply not ready. That I would address it when I was ready. That there would come a time when I understood what to do with it and I would do it then." She looked at her hands. But readiness, I have discovered, is a condition that is very easily deferred when deferring it is more comfortable than not deferring it. I deferred it for 15 years. And then I sold the house, which I had not intended to sell for another 5 years but which became necessary when my health made living alone impractical, and I realized that the box was still on the shelf and I was no longer in the house to do anything about it. "You could have taken it with you," I said. "I could have," she agreed. "I chose not to. I think I chose not to because somewhere in the decision to leave the house, I also made a decision to leave what I had been carrying in it. To give it to someone else to help me address. I am 83 years old and I do not have unlimited time left to keep deciding I am not yet ready." I looked at her in her green chair with the blue lamp beside her and the books arranged on the shelves in the configuration of a life compressed and carried, and I thought about the box in the corner of our hallway, its precise corners, its yellowed tape, sitting there for 7 days as though waiting. "What exactly is in the box?" I said. "Letters," she said. "A photograph. Some financial documents. And a name." "The child's name," I said. "Yes," she said. "Edmund's child. Who is now in their mid-50s and who, as far as I know, has no idea that Edmund Whitmore existed." I sat with this for a moment. "You want to find them," I said. "I want to try," she said. "I am aware that this person may not want to be found. I am aware that this may cause pain I am not entitled to cause. But I have been sitting with the alternative, which is that this person goes their entire life not knowing something true about themselves, and I find I can no longer sit comfortably with it. She looked at me. I am asking for your help, she said. Not because I know you. But because you live in the house where I kept this for 15 years, and because the way you walked through those rooms during the viewings told me you were someone who paid attention to what a house was actually saying rather than simply what it looked like. She stood then, with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body requires more intention to move than it once did, and she went to a side table drawer and removed from it a box that I recognized immediately, not the box from our hallway, which was still there, waiting, but a duplicate in some sense. Smaller. A shoebox, old, with its own careful tape at the seams. She held it for a moment. This is what was in the box on your shelf, she said. I made copies. Photographs of the photographs. Transcriptions of the letters, in my own handwriting. The originals are still in your house, in the box Robert doesn't know about. She held the shoebox toward me. I'm asking you to help me find someone, she said. And I'm asking you to understand, before you open this, that what's inside it is the kind of information that, once you have it, changes how you see certain things. Not just about Edmund. About keeping things. About what it costs. I looked at the shoebox in her hands. I thought, and I do not entirely understand why I thought this specifically in that moment, about Robert, assembling the bookshelf in the study while I drove here on an errand I had described inaccurately. About the particular quality of his nod when I told him where I was going. About the trust implied in that nod and about what I was, or wasn't, doing with it. I reached out and took the shoebox. I set the shoebox on my knees and looked at it for a moment before opening it. There is a specific quality to the pause before opening something that contains someone else's private history, a quality that is different from ordinary anticipation, more weighted, more aware of its own irreversibility. Once you open it, you cannot be someone who hasn't seen what's inside. That threshold, once crossed, exists permanently in the past tense rather than the present. I opened it. The first thing I saw was a photograph. It was a small photograph, the kind produced by cameras of the mid-1960s, with a slightly soft focus and the particular quality of color that photographs from that era have, slightly warm, slightly faded at the edges, as though the image has been slowly retreating from its own surface for 60 years. It showed a young man, perhaps 21 or 22, standing in front of a building I didn't recognize, wearing a coat that was slightly too large for him in the way of a young man who has recently grown into himself but has not yet grown into his wardrobe. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at something to his left, slightly above frame, and his expression had the specific quality of someone caught in a genuine moment rather than posed for a portrait. He was handsome in an unremarkable way. Pleasant. The kind of face that would be easy to trust. Edmund, Agnes said, from her chair. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I was looking for something, though I hadn't yet articulated to myself what I was looking for. The face of a man who had made a choice, perhaps. Evidence of something in his expression that would help me understand how a person who appeared pleasant and trustworthy could have conducted an entire chapter of his life as though it were a different book. I found nothing specific. He was simply a young man in a coat, looking at something outside the frame. I set the photograph aside and lifted the next item from the box. It was a letter, handwritten in Agnes's careful, upright script, which I recognized from the viewing. She had left us a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, a list of things we needed to know about the house, written in precisely this hand. The transcription she had made of the original letter. I read it. The letter was from the woman. Agnes had given her a name in the transcription, in brackets, because the original had been signed only with an initial. The name was Patricia, or Pat, and she had written in the particular, controlled language of someone who has decided to be practical rather than emotional about something that is deeply emotional. She was managing, Pat wrote. She was not asking for anything. She had a sister who would help. She thought it was better this way, cleaner, and she hoped he agreed. She wished him well. She asked only that he not contact her. The letter was dated March 1968. Edmund would have been 22. The child, if the child had been born at term, which was not stated but which the letter's timing suggested, would have been born in approximately the autumn of 1968. Which meant, if still living, that this child was now in their mid-50s. Which meant they had been alive for the entirety of Agnes and Edmund's 51 years in that house. Had been somewhere in the world, growing up, becoming a person, living a life, for every single one of those years. I looked up from the letter. Did Edmund ever try to find them? I asked. No, Agnes said. Pat's letter was clear. He respected it, or told himself he was respecting it. I think, she said, with the careful honesty she had been applying to everything since my arrival, that respecting it was also considerably more convenient than not respecting it. He had met me by then. We were already in the early stages of what would become our marriage. Pursuing Pat, or the child, would have required him to introduce into his new life something from his previous one that he preferred to treat as concluded. He chose convenience, I said. Not harshly. Simply as an observation. He chose, Agnes said, in the way that people choose when they are young and frightened and have been offered what appears to be a clean exit. He took the clean exit. I am not certain I would not have done the same at 22. She paused. What I am certain of, she said, is that the exit was not as clean as it appeared. It simply looked clean because he never checked the other side of the door. I looked back at the letter. At Pat's controlled, practical handwriting. At the specific discipline of a woman who had decided to need nothing from a man she had trusted and who had, by the available evidence, not quite earned that trust. There's more in the box, Agnes said. There was. 2 additional letters, not from Pat but from Edmund himself, drafts of letters he had apparently written and never sent, discovered by Agnes inside the cover of a book in his study, tucked there with the careful concealment of something he couldn't discard but also couldn't display. The drafts were undated but appeared, from context, to have been written sometime in the late 1970s, which was to say, nearly a decade into his marriage to Agnes, nearly a decade after Pat's letter closing the door. In the first draft, Edmund had written to Pat, or had attempted to write to her, asking only whether the child was well. Nothing more than that. Just whether the child was well. The letter was abandoned mid-sentence and had never been finished. In the second draft, written on a different paper and in a slightly different hand, older, Agnes said, she believed it was from several years later, he had written further. He had said he understood he had no right to any information. He had said he was not asking for anything. He had said only that he thought about them, and that he wanted them to know, even if they never read the letter, that he had not forgotten. This letter was also abandoned. Also never finished. Also never sent. Both had been kept, folded carefully, inside the cover of a book that Agnes named, a novel, an unremarkable one, the kind that fills shelves without being particularly read, that she had found in a box of Edmund's things after his death. He kept drafts of letters he never sent, I said. For decades, Agnes said. He kept the evidence of his own continuing feeling about the situation without ever actually doing anything about the situation. He held it privately. He carried it inside the marriage without the marriage knowing it was there. I set down the second draft. There were financial records at the bottom of the box. Agnes had transcribed these too, in her careful hand. They showed, across a period from approximately 1978 to 1992, a series of regular, modest payments made from an account that was not the couple's joint account but a private one that Agnes had not known existed until she found it in the papers after his death. The payments were made to an address in a town 2 hours from ours, and they stopped in 1992. Agnes had, at some point in the 15 years since Edmund's death, driven to that address. The house was there. An ordinary semi-detached house on an ordinary residential street. She had sat outside it for 20 minutes and then driven home. "Did you knock?" I asked. No, she said. Why not? She was quiet for a moment. Because I was afraid, she said. Not of what I would find. I think I was afraid of what it would mean for how I understood Edmund, if I found something real on the other side of the door. While I didn't knock, I could still tell myself that the payments had been to Pat, that they had been a private form of support she had eventually declined, that the child was perhaps not part of this at all. Knocking would have required me to know. You chose not to know, I said. I chose not to know, she agreed. For 15 years. She looked at me with the particular directness she had been deploying throughout our conversation. And now I am asking you to help me know, she said. Because I am 83 and I have recently understood, with a clarity that I wish had arrived earlier, that choosing not to know is not the same as the thing being absent. It is simply the thing being present in the dark instead of the light. And things kept in the dark have a way of shaping you without your awareness, in ways that knowing them directly, and painfully, and with full information, would not have. I sat with this for a long moment. And then something happened that I had not anticipated when I drove to Whitmore Lane that afternoon. Something in what Agnes had just said, the specific, precise sentence about things kept in the dark shaping you without your awareness, landed somewhere that was not about Agnes and Edmund at all. It landed somewhere personal. I want to tell you about Robert, and I want to tell you carefully, because the thing I am about to describe is not dramatic and is not a revelation and is not anything that would, described to a third party, necessarily sound significant. But it was significant to me. It had been significant to me. On some level I had been deliberately not examining, for considerably longer than I had allowed myself to acknowledge. Robert was, like Edmund Whitmore had apparently been, a fundamentally good man. I want to say this first, as Agnes had said it first, because I think the truth of it is foundational to everything else. He was kind, reliable, principled in the specific, practical way of someone who has internalized decency rather than performed it. He had been, throughout our 4 years of marriage, the person he presented himself as being, which is not as common as it should be and which I had always understood as something to be genuinely valued. But Robert kept things. Not in the dramatic sense that Edmund had kept things, not letters in books, not private accounts, not entire chapters of a previous life folded carefully away. In a smaller sense. A quieter sense. The sense of a man who processed things internally, privately, in a space that remained consistently his own regardless of how much of the rest of his life he shared with me. I had attributed this, throughout our marriage, to temperament. Robert was private by nature, as some people are, and I had understood his privacy as a fixed quality of his character rather than as a choice he was making, repeatedly, about how much of himself to actually share with me. There were specific things I did not know about Robert. I did not know, fully, what he thought about his work. He described it, answered questions about it, but there was a layer beneath the description that I had never accessed, a layer of actual feeling about the hours he spent in a career he had not exactly chosen but had also never exactly left. I did not know what he thought about our life. Again, he was not withholding in any obvious sense. He talked to me, he was present, but there was something underneath his presence that had always felt slightly unexplored, as though the version of Robert I had access to was thorough but not complete. I did not know, and this was the thing that had been sitting at the bottom of what I hadn't examined, why he had been quiet in the specific way he had been quiet for the past 8 months, since before the house purchase, since before the move, in a way that was not cold and not distant but that had a quality of inwardness to it that I had noticed and filed and not addressed. I had not addressed it because addressing it would have required acknowledging that I had noticed it, and acknowledging that I had noticed it would have required us to have a conversation that I was not certain I was ready for. I was choosing, I understood sitting in Agnes's daughter's sitting room with Edmund's private history on my knees, not to know. In exactly the way Agnes had chosen not to know, for 15 years, what was on the other side of the door she hadn't knocked on. Agnes, I said. Yes, she said. She had been watching me. I had the sense she had been waiting for this, for something in me to surface, the way you wait for something to surface when you have said a true thing to someone and the true thing is finding its way down to a level where it has personal purchase. The thing you said, I said. About choosing not to know not being the same as the thing being absent. About things in the dark shaping you without your awareness. Yes, she said. I think I have been doing that, I said. Not about Robert and the way you were talking about Edmund. But about something. About a space in my marriage that I have been walking past for 8 months without looking directly at it. Agnes looked at me steadily. Then perhaps, she said, you came here for more than one reason. I looked down at the shoebox on my knees, at Edmund's unfinished letters and Pat's controlled goodbye and the financial records of a man trying to do something good in the only private way he knew how. What do I do? I said. And I was not asking only about the box and the address and the person in their mid-50s who might or might not want to be found. Agnes considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. You go home, she said. You look at the thing you've been walking past. And then you decide whether the cost of knowing is higher or lower than the cost of continuing not to. She looked at me with the specific, unapologetic clarity of a woman who has learned this lesson at considerable expense and is passing it on without softening it. In my experience, she said, it is always lower.